Today I'm honoured to be with Andrew Powell, representative of the Glasshouse electorate in the Queensland Parliament. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad, Timothy.
Excellent. So to start us off, could you provide the audience a bit of a brief biographical sketch of who you are and your history with Christianity and how you came to be an MP with that?
Sure. Well, for a range of reasons, my parents were both Queenslanders, married and moved to Melbourne, where I was born just over 50 years ago. Moved around a lot as a kid. Melbourne, Brisbane, Rocky, Brisbane, Melbourne, Sydney, back to Brisbane.
Been everywhere.
Gave me a really good breadth of educational backgrounds, different styles of schooling in different states. But one constant throughout that was church. Very blessed to have Christian parents, and indeed many of both my and my wife's extended family are also Christians. But I guess it was when I was a teenager at a church in Sydney at the time when my youth group leader kind of explained to me that it's all well and good to have Christian parents and attend church, but that's not what actually makes you a Christian. Yeah. And put the hard word on me, and no, actually it wasn't a hard word at all. It was a very, very soft word, and I made that commitment then. And just a little aside, we caught up with that guy a couple of years ago. They now live in Port Macquarie, and he had no idea that he'd be the reason I've become a Christian. My wife shared it with him, and he actually had a tear in his eye. So yeah, we eventually settled back in Queensland. I finished my schooling at Grace Lutheran College out at Redcliffe. Went off to university, University of Queensland, that is, the real university.
There's a debate about that, but
sure. Not back in my day. Did science and arts degrees, but more importantly got involved in a group called, what was then called Student Life. It's now known as Power to Change. Yeah. And that was pivotal. I think university days are that time where we can head a couple of different directions, and mine well and truly kept me on the faith path. That being said, despite heading off on short-term missions around the place and meeting the future wife, who was even more heavily interested in serving overseas, I sought my service within the public service. So I left uni and went down to Canberra, where I joined the Department of Defence as a public service servant. My wife Taryn, who was a physio, joined me 2 years later. We only lasted there 2 years before we actually did try the short-term mission option, and we went over and worked in Fiji. That was cut short by the coup. In 2000, we ended up back in Queensland, where we started our family. Eventually settled in the Sunshine Coast hinterland, a place called Palmwoods. Have had 5 kids, now aged between 23 and 14, and went from Queensland public service to deciding I was frustrated on that side of the fence and put my hand up for politics.
Yeah, right.
Is that truncated enough?
Yeah, I reckon. So just with regards to your missionary work, do you think that contributed anything toward where you are now at all?
Yeah, I think both Taryn and I don't want this to sound glib, but having been through Student Life Power to Change, very much a focus on serving in the field. Yeah. I think we needed to do that, not so much to tick a box, but to determine whether it was right for us. Yeah. And there were a number of clear messages while we were in Fiji, and then for a brief couple of months in New Zealand working at the regional office, that made it clear that it was always going to be a challenge for me to try and serve, particularly me, to serve in overseas settings, health-wise. But funnily enough, even those experiences, I often think the culmination of all of my ministry through work culminated in a short period as a minister in the Queensland government, and everything I'd done to that point, including that time in Fiji and New Zealand, contributed to the skill set I needed to be a good leader of a department in that sense, and part of the team sitting around a cabinet table.
Yeah, okay. So when I was looking at your portfolio, one thing that jumped out to me was that you worked in the Child Department of Safety for a brief period of time. What was that experience like, and what perspectives did that bring?
So the Department of Child Safety, I was actually there for 4 years, and thank the Lord I wasn't on the front line. I don't think I could have done that I must admit, having been raised the way I'd been raised in a middle-class family, Christian middle-class family, not rich but not without, I was a bit oblivious to another side of our society.
Yeah.
It didn't take long to get introduced to it through the Department of Child Safety, and it's horrific.
Yeah.
It was and it is, and I take my hat off to all of those people who work in the front line, whether they be child safety officers or police officers, family support workers. It actually was, I guess, that pivotal moment where I decided I needed to consider politics instead of public service. The government at the time admitted that the child protection system was broken, had gone to an election with a mandate to say, I've got a plan, I want to fix it. But I was watching the state government become parents of kids and then being more dysfunctional parents than the parents they were taken off.
Yeah.
Those kids in state care were not doing any better. I think, in fact, in some ways we made things worse. Don't get me wrong, there are parents that we need to remove children from for very obvious safety reasons, but if we're going to do that, we have a responsibility to care and provide for those kids in a way that their parents wouldn't have.
Yeah, no, definitely. My family has been somewhat involved with the foster care system as parents and guardians, and from that experience we can definitely see that there are loopholes and corruptions that definitely could be rectified. But what do you think could change that corruption in the system, and how do you think Christians can be an influence there?
I probably wouldn't go as far as to use the word corruption. I think it is a broken system. I think what we're not doing is identifying families who need support soon enough. If you look at models around other parts of the world, you know, if I think of Canada, a kid turning up at prep in Canada gets tested for a whole range of things, not only just literacy and numeracy. They get their physical movements, their diet, all of those things, their eyes, their ears. And I think early on, those kind of jurisdictions can identify families that need a little bit of support. And we've got to start identifying those families at that very early stage and wrapping our arms around them. Financially, it works out better for the state too. There's some studies done that say if you spend $1 at that point, you save $100 down here. And you can see that by the time a kid gets to 16 and has been in the system for 12 years, they're costing us $1 million sometimes.
Yeah, no, I can imagine.
We've got to support our foster carers. We've got to make that a more attractive option for people to consider. And there are a lot of Christians who put their hand up and take that on, but I also know that breaks a lot of those families. It's hard work. Some of these kids are coming from very broken homes. Some of these kids have very challenging behaviours. Some of them have very interesting medical diagnoses or disabilities. And so it really is a case of wrapping our arms around them as a community, as the old adage goes, rather than just hanging everyone out to dry.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, and despite that difficulty in being involved with that system, it's definitely something that I would recommend Christians being involved with, because there's a lot that can be done in that area. So I guess as a Christian, how do you carry yourself in Parliament, which is, you know, generally considered as a very secular environment?
That's the tough question, isn't it, Timothy?
Yeah.
Look, at the outset, let me say, I think every vocation needs Christians. Every single one. I think there are ministry fields across all professions, and politics is no different. We need people of faith in that role. How do I do it? I guess I probably do it a little bit different than some might. I often refer to the passages that talk about being salt and light. And as we know, in cooking in particular, you put a bit too much salt on it, it tastes dreadful. You don't put enough, you don't notice it. You put the right amount, it kind of works. It's a case of sometimes knowing when to pick your fights and sometimes knowing when to just stay quiet. And that won't sit well with some Christians who hear this. You know, that there is no doubt that our Judeo-Christian values are being challenged. We are no longer I would say, a Judeo-Christian nation state. Our laws are changing before us. The numbers of people who identify as Christian is reducing. I know that alarms a lot of people. I'm a little bit different. I kind of suspect that's inevitable in many cases. If you read parts of the Bible, it's even prophesied.
And you could make the case that it's been like that for quite a while.
It's not going to change.
Yeah.
I don't know that, we're not going to necessarily be able to hold on to everything that we hold dear, and perhaps nor should we. So it's again picking the right moments and being that influence in the room that you potentially can be.
So I guess with that in mind, how would you navigate more controversial issues such as abortion and euthanasia and transgenderism, where Christianity has quite a clear but controversial opinion on?
One of the advantages I have of being in the party that I'm involved in, we get a conscience vote on matters of life and death. So that goes to abortion, euthanasia. And so I've been unshackled from having to hold a party political line and being able to make a determination on my own. And my decisions on those matters in particular are on the public record. I've voted against every iteration of them. And I've outlined why, not just based on Christian values, but on ethical and moral research that I've done. And you have to, at the end of the day, look yourself in the mirror and be comfortable with who you are. And so, again, I'm grateful that my party affords me a conscience vote on those matters.
Yeah, that's definitely an advantage compared to some other parties.
Other parties expect you to hold it more rigidly.
Yeah. So I guess you've sort of touched on the tension that can be between outspoken Christians and other Christians who are probably maybe a little bit more relational. I guess the way I like to think of it is in terms of that verse that you mentioned, being light and salt, but sort of looking at it in the perspective of members of Christ's body, as Paul has mentioned in various passages. So I guess God gives us various abilities to work in different capacities, and it's a very holistic and complementarian system, I guess. And I guess you can look at salt and light as two different things, with salt being stationary and it doesn't move from where it's put in place, but it's quite effective where it is placed. And I guess the quintessential example of that is Daniel in the Old Testament. He was obviously a very influential person in the Babylonian government, but he didn't sort of put himself out there, but he spoke when it was required. And I guess that's different to light, which obviously moves very rapidly, and its work is quite apparent, I guess, and obvious to the eye. And so we see that a lot in the Old Testament and the New Testament with the prophets and the apostles, and maybe even Jesus Christ himself, where they speak dogmatic truths, and they say it when nobody asked for it necessarily, and those truths can very much be controversial.
Yep.
So I guess with that in mind, what persuaded you to be more of a salt type of Christian in Parliament?
That's a great question. And as you pointed out, I too believe there's a role for both versions of Christian in ministry in a workplace. I don't know, is the short answer and the honest answer. It's something that I've grappled with throughout my professional career, and that's 30 years now. It's something that I've got together with particularly other men in professions, and we've thrashed through. We've read the Bible, we've read explanatory books on unpacking passages of the Bible, we've prayed, we've talked. I've seen examples where both of those versions of Christians have worked effectively. I've seen where they've both fallen in a heap. And I guess it's something I've fallen into, but also constantly challenge whether it's the right way for me and for God.
Yeah. definitely a difficult balance sometimes. So for our Queensland listeners, could you describe what is happening with the Respect at Work and Other Matters Amendment Bill? I'm sure you've heard this question before.
Yeah, I have. So there's a number of elements in this bill that are not unexpected and potentially quite non-controversial. There are other elements that are concerning. Fortunately, it looks like the current government stepped away from some even more controversial aspects that they were considering as part of reviewing the Anti-Discrimination Act and so on. But there are elements in this that are still concerning us. It's gone through our committee process. The concerns of the broader community, but particularly the Christian community, have been well aired through that committee process. Our party's members on that committee put in a statement of reservation expressly around some of those aspects that are worrying us. At this point in time, we have a process as a party whereby our shadow cabinet will consider that committee report and the submissions. We'll come to a position that we then put to our party room. The party room will confirm, change or otherwise, and then we'll enunciate that position when the bill comes to the Parliament.
Yeah. So what should be, in your opinion, as a Christian parliamentarian, be the relationship between the church and state here in a country such as Australia?
This is asking some great questions. Again, this might sound controversial to some and upsetting to some, but I don't think the church has benefited from being too heavily involved in the state. If you look at the early church, sure, it was being persecuted, but it was also at the time when it was real and it was growing. When it became a state-based religion, it was heavily watered down, corrupted. The state imposed its structures on the church rather than letting the church be the organic body of Christ. And whilst in some ways that helped to spread the word, it also helped to spread corruption of the word. And so I studied modern European history in particular, and you start with looking at the Roman Empire and then the ongoing Holy Roman Empire and how it was interwoven between the Pope and the Catholic religion, and then the Lutherans, and how it all just unfolded in that regard. And there have been huge benefits of church and state being closely tied together, but as I mentioned earlier, I think those days are gone. I strongly believe that I don't think we are any longer a Judeo-Christian nation or state. Our laws are changing. There is a sense of inevitability in that to me. There's a sense of excitement about that. I think things are going to get real. I think you are or you aren't going to be a Christian.
Yeah.
We see that in the census. The nominalism is dropping off. So people are no longer saying just because my parents were Anglican, I'm an Anglican, or just because my parents were Presbyterian, I'm Presbyterian. They're now choosing for themselves. I think this is a challenging time for those of us who are Christians and those of us who are in churches, because we need to go back to the basics and understand what grace and love, forgiveness looks like in a world that no longer necessarily agrees with everything that we agree with.
Yeah, definitely. I think some Christians here in Western societies could do with a little bit of a challenge.
Yeah,
from time to time.
It goes back to what you were saying before. There's a time
Yeah.
for us to speak up, but there's also a time for us to shut up and to show some more grace and love and forgiveness.
I guess that's very dependent on the circumstances,
Yep.
but yes. Yeah, so I was looking through Paul's letters when he's talking about the relationship between church and state, and from what I can gather, there is definitely like separation between the two. But I guess separation doesn't necessarily mean a lack of cooperation or any influence one way or the other. So where we have the opportunity to do so, I think we as Christians can definitely have a positive influence in government practices. So this sort of ties into this a little bit, but what do you think about the current state of the church in Australia? Where is it strong and where is it weak?
I think I'll let people better qualified than me to determine that one. I do know what my wife and I look for. We'd look for good biblical teaching. We really value people unpacking the Bible for us, and whether that's in a church setting or whether that's in a small group setting or whether that's us doing it ourselves, we find that important. We think gathering together to worship is important. Being parents of 5 kids, we're looking for opportunity for our kids to find fellow young people to share in listening to good sermons, good messages, and worshipping and having social activities. So I think they're all important. I think one of the things we've been grappling with is that there was a phrase maybe a decade or 2 ago called hospitality evangelism, where we're just being good neighbours, we're being good community members as a church and as Christians. And I think sometimes, again, if you go back to the early churches, that's something they did really well. They gathered together, they shared meals,
It's very different in some ways.
Yeah, cultures are, but Australians love getting around a barbecue. So to me, there's things that churches can be doing to look outwards into the broader community.
You answered that
like
question
a politician.
Very much like a politician.
Like a politician.
I guess we'll let it slide.
I genuinely think. Look, I'm not a theologian. There are others who understand church dynamics and how churches operate better than me.
Fair enough. So if you could instantly secure one legislation of your own free will for Queensland, what would it be and why?
Wow. I am genuinely going to have to take that one on notice and come back to you, Timothy.
All right, I'll pin it on the YouTube comments.
Pin it on the YouTube comments. That's a cracking question. Normally, in our job, we're more reactive, and to be upfront, my side of politics has been in opposition for 4 of the 5 terms I've served. So that's over 12 of the 15 plus years I've been in here. We've been very reactive to legislation that's been put in the Parliament rather than necessarily driving it. So probably part of my inability to answer that straight off is a mindset that's come from 4 terms in opposition. But I'll come back to you.
Sure. What do you have to say to young Christians who perhaps have no interest in politics at all?
That would concern me. As we've been discussing, there needs to be a separation potentially between church and state, but that doesn't mean we don't participate in civic society. And that every vote is important. I have a former colleague who lost their seat by 9 votes. Wow. 9 votes. That means if 5 people had changed their vote, there would have been a different outcome. I also am concerned people look at other jurisdictions around the world where voting is not compulsory, and we comment on the outcome and can't quite understand how they got there.
Yeah.
If you don't, compulsory voting, if you want to turn up and you genuinely are disengaged, then sure, you can cast a donkey vote, but you've had your say at least. But in doing so, you also abdicate your right to challenge the outcome. So if you're not going to participate, you can't be unhappy with what eventuates.
Yeah.
And the only other thing I'd say is do your research. Look at the parties, look at their value base, look at their policies, come to your own decision who you vote for.
Yeah. Sometimes that also means looking at the individual people who are running rather than the parties per se.
Yep. Well and truly look at your individual candidates. I'll be honest, you won't find a party that aligns with your value base 100%.
Definitely.
So you've got to look for the one that aligns 80%.
Yeah. All right, so I guess on the flip side, what do you have to say to young Christians who perhaps have a little too much enthusiasm about politics?
That's not a bad thing either. Depending on how young. The advice that I was literally just at a school where I was talking to a group of Year 7 students, and the question was, if someone in this room wanted to become a politician, what's the advice you'd give? And whilst all for young people running for politics, and we have a number running for our party and as candidates across the state this time around, the one thing I would say is have a life outside of politics too. Politics is all-consuming. Yeah. It is all-consuming, and the only way you stay sane is if you've got an anchor outside of politics. So if you are fixated with politics, go and find another hobby to go alongside it.
Okay. Yeah, no. It would be a very sad world to live in where politics is the be-all and end-all in life.
There's so much else in life to enjoy too.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just in terms of Christianity itself, I mean, there's much more greater things to be found within the Bible and within the teachings of Jesus Christ, rather than what so-and-so says in Parliament and in government halls and writings and speeches. So, yeah, thankfully as Christians we have a greater truth that surpasses policies and legislation. And I guess in spite of our sin and rebellion, God did love us, and He sent His only Son, Jesus Christ, into the world to take that punishment on our behalf, that whoever believes on Him will not perish but have everlasting life. And that greater truth, that grace and mercy, is something that is definitely wonderful to think about and put our faith and hope in.
Yep.
Okay.
To be blunt, I don't know how you'd operate without that.
Sure. But I guess it sometimes depends on where your emphasis is.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right, Mr. Powell, it's been a pleasure.
Too easy. If I've got a chance, I have thought of a piece of legislation that I'm pretty passionate about.
All right, go ahead.
Our education system is broken. We have gone down a path now where we are trying to fit kids into a box rather than trying to teach a kid the best way for that individual child. I think our education laws, our curriculum need to be rewritten and looked at, and I think in doing so we'll teach kids how to think, to use their innate abilities, and to be able to move into a world where we don't know what it holds. And I think something like that would have long-lasting generational impact, and I'd be very proud to be a part of such legislation. Sorry, I know you finished on a lovely note, but I didn't want to leave that one unanswered.
That's all right. I was looking forward to the comment.
The footnote.
That's all right. We'll make do without. Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Timothy, thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Cheers, mate.